please go ahead and remind people to mute themselves unless they're trying to or asking a question or speaking.
Well, I think you've done that already, Terry. So I will just affirm what you just said, that unless you're speaking, it'd be good if you're muted. So good evening. You are here for the workshop organized by the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council on moving toward multiracial unity, positive ways and negative routes. And we have a panel of 4 of us who are going to be speaking during this workshop. So I'm going to be actually the first speaker. And a little bit about me. Again, my name is Alan Linthrop. I'm the current board chair of the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council. I've been a UU Unitarian since fall of '59. So I've been a lay leader in several UU congregations and active also in some regional groups and metro groups and so forth within our faith. Also been a social justice activist throughout my life. And I am, again, the current board chair with UUMUAC. And I will be speaking about American history and how multiracial unity has made advances for racial justice through our history. The second speaker is going to be the Reverend Richard Trudeau. And Richard will be talking more about some of those negative routes that have popped up and hurt efforts toward multiracial progress or racial progress. And Richard started his career as a math teacher, and then in kind of a middle age, he decided to study and go into the UU ministry, which he did on a full-time basis for a couple decades. And since retirement, he has continued to be like a part-time UU preacher. And he was the UU MUAC board chair prior to myself, and now serves as its secretary. Our third panelist is going to be the Reverend Jack Reich. Jack in his younger years was a UU minister in Los Angeles. He's been an activist and a board member with the Humanist Association for many, many years. And in recent years, he's been active with UU MUAC and currently serves as its vice president. And Jack will be talking about the moral fusion movement of the Poor People's Campaign. And last, we have Dr. Dick Burkhart. Dick has a doctorate in mathematics. He had a long career with the Boeing Company. He's been a social justice activist, particularly for economic justice, throughout his life. And he is currently on our board as the treasurer. So he took over from myself as treasurer. So, and he's going to be speaking about some current authors and how they have talked about, best ways to move toward a more, positive advancement for race relations in this country. So I begin by saying that in the colonial period, there wasn't a lot of efforts for multiracial unity. There were a couple, but they were not well organized enough to be successful. There was one in the Marymount colony, which is part of what was the Massachusetts colony. It was a commune, and Charles Morton there, who organized that and operated that between about 1626 and 1630, was primarily trying to build multiracial unity between the colonists and the local Algonquin Native American tribes, both in trading and inviting them into the commune to have a lot of celebrations, bringing in some of their seasonal celebrations, which might be considered pagan celebrations, as part of that, to try to encourage opportunities for the colonists, who were mainly white men, to find wives among the Native American population. But the Puritans didn't like that effort, and they crushed it militarily after a few years. Then in 1676, we had Bacon's Rebellion in the South, in Virginia, where Nathaniel Bacon tried to organize a lot of poor whites, some of whom were indentured servants, others just poor farmers, along with a number of the Africans in the colony and some indentured Native Americans, to fight back against the planter elite in that colony to get a better shake. But unfortunately, that also was crushed by military force. Once we get into the 19th century, you get into the abolitionist movements. And obviously you had to have to make progress throughout history. You've got to, if you're fighting as a minority group, racial or otherwise, you need to have allies among the broader population. And then in the United States, that's meant with the white population in order to make progress. And so that abolition movement gained speed because it was a moral movement among many white Americans, combined with the efforts of free blacks and those who were recently escaped from slavery to both educate and inspire the population to get behind abolition. And this, I guess if you want to say the culmination of that pre-Civil War period was the raid by John Brown on Harper's Ferry, where we had a multiracial group trying to incite blacks in the South to rise up for their freedom. Then, of course, we have the Civil War, and there, was first a struggle to, maintain the Union, but with emancipation, you had a moral infusion, and not only could you bring in black soldiers to fight with, the Union Army to win the war along with the white soldiers, but many more of the white soldiers were now fighting for abolition, not just to save the Union. And so once we got after the Civil War, of course, you had to have a lot of liberal, progressive white Americans still on the cause for black equality to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to our Constitution. Of course, in the South, we had, a coalition of newly freed blacks with progressive whites who were already in the South and whites who moved into the South to try to encourage blacks to, develop their capabilities and build a multiracial society. Unfortunately, that movement got crushed by the KKK and allied forces, as we all know. Once we moved into the 20th century, we had some new progress. Again, when we had blacks and whites together forming the NAACP in 1909. And then when you get into the period between the First and Second World War, you had a lot of industrial unions being formed. And a lot of these industries had people of multiple races. Those unions became multiracial unions in fighting. And this also helped, was a solidarity for their economic cause, but also built a background for multiracial unity for other racial equality. Then again, you had finally World War II. And again, you had Americans of all colors fighting against racism in the face of, which took the name of fascism. And that was a successful fight. Then we had beginnings of the civil rights movement early after World War II. And you had the armed forces being integrated. And later the NAACP fighting a lot of cases in the courts, getting Brown versus Board of Education victorious in 54 to end, Jim Crow segregation by law, though it wasn't changed by fact at that point. And then, of course, the civil rights movement led by Dr. King, where, it was a call to, again, a moral righteousness and what's right, and having everybody bring whatever they could of all races to that fight. That was successful in eventually getting the Civil Rights Act of 1963, ended, the restrictions on public accommodations, and then the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1968 Housing Act. With that series of things, you basically ended racial segregation, but you had economic forces that still wanted workers to be divided, and they created a new racism, neo-racism, which was not strictly based on race, but more class-based, where they had indicators of education and intelligence and culture indicating who should be among the upper class, the management class versus the lower class workers and the unemployed. So it was no longer strictly race-based, but it often had very distinct flavors of one race being more in one camp or class and so forth. And in this period, you had groups like the International Coalition Against Racism fighting against this neo-racism. And in more recent years, you've had the Poor People's Campaign. And of course, within our denomination, the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council has fought against that. So with that, I'm going to end my time. Could go on, but we each have a limit on our time. So I'm going to turn this now over to Richard Trudeau, who's going to talk about some of the ways that we've gone off the good path in fighting for racial justice and racial equality. Richard.
Hi. Our mission has been to promote multiracial unity, and that has, of course, a corollary. If we want to promote multiracial unity, that obliges us, I think, to oppose programs that promote multiracial disunity. And it appeared to more and more of us that the UUA's supposedly anti-racist initiative, which is now about 30 years old, actually promotes multiracial disunity. The UU's program has been based on a redefinition of race. The word racism has been defined in all of our dictionaries for a long, long time as race-based prejudice. But the UUA has redefined or accepted a redefinition of racism as meaning prejudice plus power. Prejudice plus power. It's prejudice only on the part of a group that has power. And this whole way of looking at things treats people not as individuals, but as representatives of groups. And so the consequence of this is that only whites can be racist because as a group, whites are more powerful than others, completely neglecting, of course, all the poor and disadvantaged whites, but whites as a group are more powerful. So this means that only whites can be racist. And it also means that all whites are racist. And of course, with the definition of racism in the dictionaries, this is a racist position. If you know nothing about someone except their race and you attribute something to them, that's a racist thing to do. And if you attribute racism to everybody with a white skin, that's a racist thing to do by the original definition of racism. But the UUA said, oh, no, 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 no. All these professors and all these people with advanced degrees, they've explained that the dictionary is wrong, that racism has a different meaning. And you whites, you're the only people who are racist. No one else is racist. And all of you are racist. And we in UMIAC, which is the way we pronounce our long acronym, UUMUAC, or some of us pronounce it, excuse me. I pronounce it that way. We see this as first of all, a racist position in the obvious way that it's racism toward white people. It's an anti-white racism. But more importantly, really, and this was our concern, what the UUA was doing was racist in a way that was against black and brown people, against the black and brown rank and file. The way the UUA has been doing it is to take a few members of the black and brown elite, people with Ivy League educations and privileged backgrounds. And these people join the national administration and they claim to represent their entire race. And they benefit themselves, of course, by being hired in the UUA and getting big salaries and having friends of theirs come in and also get big salaries. But they're doing nothing to benefit the black rank and file, nothing. And so this is really racist in a way that harms the black and brown rank and file too. When our founder, the Reverend Dr. Finley Campbell, founded the Arrow. The Arrow is our newsletter, or our journal, rather, our journal, which comes out several times a year. He introduced the Arrow in its first issue in this way. He had just attended the April 2017 annual assembly of the Mid-America UUA region. And this is what he said about what he encountered there. He said, because of my commitment to this great ideal of multiracial unity, I was appalled by the racism exhibited against my white brothers and sisters, symbolized by the constant assertion that we were somehow conscious and unconscious proponents of white supremacy, a term I associate with lynching, race riots, and brutal discrimination. During the so-called worship service the night of the 28th, this is April 2017, I was outraged by the way that at every key moment, a worship associate would launch a neo-racist attack on me. To the best of my knowledge, it was Dr. Campbell who originated the term neo-racism, though it's pretty widely used now. Excuse me, I interrupted that sentence. I was so outraged by the way that at every key moment, a worship associate would launch a neo-racist attack on me and the progressive folks in the room with this vicious libel that we were entangled in the spectrum of white supremacy, that we swam in a sea of white supremacy. I got up with disgust and muttered in a whisper as I walked out, "This is a bunch of neo-racist crap." And I've never known Dr. Campbell to even go that close to swearing, except in this article. Neo-racist crap, he called it. Yeah, and this is the root, I think, of the UUA's going off the rails, of abandoning Unitarian Universalism's commitment to democracy, openness to free speech, openness to Enlightenment values. Because if you want to defend an incoherent idea, and their concept of racism is an incoherent idea, if you want to defend that, you have no choice but to silence opponents. You have no choice. And this is why the UUA has been behaving this way. That's how it became authoritarian. And in connection with this, I'd like to recommend two books. I'd like to recommend our own book, Toward Multiracial Unity, Fighting Neo-Racism and Unitarian Universalism. This is selected articles from the first 7 years of our journal. And this other book, which explains where this funny new idea of racism came from. This is by a man, his name is Joseph Klein, but he's not the Joe Klein you may be familiar with. He goes by Jake. This is a different man, but he's a very competent researcher and reporter. Redefining Racism, How Racism Became Power Plus Privilege. It turns out it goes back to Stokely Carmichael. I can't really go into the details here. Let me I don't want to take up too much time, but let me do two things quickly. I said that the UUA has become authoritarian and is silencing diverse opinions. Here's a wonderful example. In May of 2022, the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council applied for a booth, an exhibit booth at the General Assembly. And we got a letter back from the executive vice president, who of course is the most important person, by the way, is unelected, the most important person in the UUA. The president is really more of a figurehead and fundraiser, but the vice president, Carrie McDonald, sent a letter to us saying that our application, we could not have a booth at the General Assembly because our mission, this is a quote, was incompatible with the core values or commitments of the UUA. The mission of the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council is incompatible, quote, with the core values or commitments of the UUA. Well, the mission of the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council is to promote multiracial unity using the 7 principles of the UUA. So he's saying that's incompatible with the values and the core values and commitments of the UUA. They've become authoritarian. And what drove us to growth in our organization, this turn in the UUA, has escaped the UUA. it's continuing in the UUA. If you look at their Mosaic RE curriculum, which is they're very proud of and have been promoting recently, this whole idea that all whites are basically racist and have evil in their hearts is throughout. This is what children are being taught, but it's not just in the UUA. This has escaped. If you read the book by Jake Klein that I held up, you can see that this has escaped into the National Education Association. This is now part of the curriculum of public school children throughout the country. It's a shame. I'll yield the rest of my time if I have any.
Okay, Jack, can unmute yourself, and you're going to be talking about the moral fusion movement of the Berber People's Campaign. So take it away.
Hi, everybody. I've put a title on my talk. I call it The Ministry and Moral Activism of Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. On a journey through Barber's life and work, I shall trace the threads from Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign to James Baldwin's searing critiques to the dignified resistance of James Earl Jones, and see how they come together in Barber's ministry, a ministry that insists our national soul is measured by how we treat the poor and marginalized. Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II was born in Indianapolis in 1963, just days after the March on Washington, which many of us remember. His family soon moved to North Carolina, participating in the desegregation efforts that upended both personal and community life. Barber's father, a physics teacher and pastor, and his mother, a school office manager, taught him early that faith is incomplete unless it bends toward justice. At 15, Barber became president of the local NAACP Youth Council. At 19, he was student body president at North Carolina Central University. After earning a BA in political science, he went on to obtain a Master of Divinity from Duke University and a Doctor of Ministry from Drew University, specializing in public policy and pastoral care. Early in adulthood, an incurable spinal disease left him in chronic pain. Barber went on to pastor the Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro for 30 years and serve as the president of the North Carolina NAACP, transforming it into a force for justice through multiracial, multi-faith fusion coalitions. This man has more honorary doctorates, awards, and arrests than a Civil Rights Hall of Fame nominee. By 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had come to believe that civil rights without economic justice was a half-finished symphony. He called for a Poor People's Campaign aiming to unite people of all colors in a fight against systemic poverty, war, and racism. King's activism was never just about sit-ins or marches. It was a profound critique of the soul of America, a belief that democracy must mean economic security for all, not just for the privileged few. King's original Poor People's Campaign marched on Washington, built Resurrection City, and demanded not just integrated lunch counters, but jobs, housing, and decent wages. After his murder, his wife and others carried on, but the momentum waned. Still, as the National Civil Rights Museum reminds us, King's legacy has endured as a model for how movements are built and why the struggle continues. Half a century later, Dr. Barber picked up this torch in North Carolina. In 2013, he convened the Moral Mondays, a trickle that soon became a river, thousands drawn together in the old fusion spirit, demanding living wages, access to health care, racial justice, and the right to vote. As Barber puts it, we decided that if they were going to crucify health care, crucify voting rights, crucify living wages, crucify employment, we had to have a witness. We didn't have the majority, but we had our moral voices. We had our right to protest. In 2018, Barber went national, co-chairing with the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris to relaunch the Poor People's Campaign as a national call for moral revival. In the spirit of King, the campaign aims to confront what Barber calls the 5 interlocking evils: systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Barber insisted poverty is neither an accident nor a personal failing. It is a product of policy choices, of mean and hurtful public policies, and it affects over 140 million people in our richest nation, nearly half of our country. Their 14-point third Reconstruction agenda is a call to reshape American democracy in practical ways: living wages, health care for all, fair housing, voting rights, and the abolition of policies that criminalize the poor. Barber echoes King. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. If King was the movement's preacher, then James Baldwin was its conscience. Baldwin, the novelist, essayist, and gay black man, saw clearly that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. He challenged America to confront its darkest contradiction. Baldwin's legacy for Barber is powerfully clear. Truth-telling is a moral act. Baldwin did not let America off the hook, and neither does Barber. Both men are masters of what Baldwin called bearing witness, naming the lie so that the nation might become true, as Baldwin put it. Barber frequently deploys the incisive language of Baldwin, reminding us that love is a battle, love is a war, love is a growing up, and that to love America is to hold it accountable to its unfulfilled promises. Baldwin's work continues to underwrite so many modern activists, including Barber's focus on intersectionality. Poverty is not just about class, but also about race, gender, and sexuality. Indeed, Barber, like Baldwin, insists that the struggle for justice must cross boundaries, must become, as Baldwin once wrote, a lover's quarrel with the world. Barber's ministry, in turn, translates Baldwin's existential clarity into concrete action. Baldwin's assertion, "I can't be a pessimist because I am alive," is mirrored in Barber's relentless hope and refusal to settle. Even in the face of repeated defeat or heartbreak, Barber is rarely to be found sulking. Rather, his message is, it's not enough to conquer the opposition. In a nonviolent struggle, we are committed to fight on until we win our adversaries as friends. Now, how does James Earl Jones, Darth Vader, Mufasa, the booming voice of gravitas, fit into this story? Jones, like King and Baldwin, came of artistic age during the upheavals of the 1960s. Instead of speeches and essays, he gave us presence, the sense that to be unapologetically oneself, the black man on the stage, the stutterer whose voice would one day move mountains, is itself an act of resistance. In the fraught 1960s, when he starred in The Great White Hope, his performance as Jack Johnson wasn't just acting, it was activism through art, embodying the confident dignity and subversive hope of Black power on the American stage. Jones' activism was subtle, sometimes silent, sometimes thundering. He saw art as activism, a means of changing the culture as much as government or policy. He showed, as Barber's own oratory does, that sometimes activism can be as simple as making art to the best of your abilities, or as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, to use beauty to set the world right. Barber, too, is an orator whose sermons echo with the musicality and drama of Jones. His public prayers, whether before thousands at the National Cathedral or while being carried to jail for civil disobedience, are performances in the best sense, acts designed to stir both conscience and courage. In an era when too many mistake volume for authority, Barber's thundering voice carries both conviction and compassion. Barber's ministry is guided by a simple but radical premise. Don't you come talking to me about Jesus unless you're standing with the poor. Faith divorced from justice, in his view, is no faith at all. Here are 6 key goals that animate his work. First, building fusion coalitions. Barber's method, inspired by both Reconstruction-era fusion politics and King's cross-racial alliances, is to unite the rejected stones, people left out of the American promise, into powerful coalitions that cut across race, class, sexuality, and faith traditions. His Poor People's Campaign is not just a repeat of the 1960s, but an explicitly intersectional grassroots movement, multiracial, interfaith, locally led, nationally coordinated. Second, confronting poverty head on. Barber calls poverty America's real epidemic. Over 140 million people are poor or one emergency away from poverty in the richest nation in the world. He argues that this is not natural or inevitable, but a result of deliberate policy choices, austerity budgets, regressive tax codes, lack of living wages, unaffordable health care, housing insecurity. If it's made by policy, it can be unmade. Third, reframing the national moral narrative. Barber insists that morality does not mean controlling culture wars, but loving your neighbor through policy. He rails against the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, which elevates personal piety over public love. In both his sermons and his organizing, he reclaims faith as a source of solidarity and prophetic dissent. Fourth, nonviolent direct action. Like King, Barber knows that some truths must be enacted, hence the relentless use of civil disobedience, the willingness to be arrested over 15 times now, in solidarity with the marginalized. Demonstrations, voter registration drives, 40-day campaigns of action, and mass marches all flow from the belief that faith without works is dead. And fifth, training the next generation. Barber is both pastor and professor, now at Yale Divinity School, where the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy trains a generation of faith leaders to see the connection between the pulpit, public policy, and moral movement building. And finally, 6, insisting on hope over despair. Above all, Barber preaches what we might call stubborn hope. He quotes the prophets. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So what can we, as ordinary Americans, do? Barber lays out a clear and actionable path. Again, 6 steps. 1, join the movement. This isn't just cheering from the sidelines. And by the way, you can join NAUA, our organization, for just $30. That's 58 cents a week. I don't think there's anybody here who can't afford 58 cents a week. Find your local Poor People's Campaign Committee. Sign up for the Moral Mondays, the voter outreach canvases, the rallies that put the poor at the center. Second, fight not just for yourself, but with others. Barber's central insight is that every movement needs fusion friends. If you're a minimum wage worker, fight for voting rights. If you're a healthcare advocate, defend the undocumented. Step across lines you once thought separated you. Third, challenge the narrative. When politicians or talk show hosts sneer at the word poor or scapegoat the suffering, challenge them publicly, persistently, but always with the generous ferocity Barber models. Don't just give charity, give justice. Fourth, vote with the margins in mind. As Barber says, if you mobilize just 10% of the poor around an agenda, you can fundamentally shift every election in this country. Don't let your vote be taken for granted. Support candidates and measures that address poverty, not just pander to fears. 5, practice prophetic imagination. Like King, like Baldwin, like Jones, dare to imagine that things can be otherwise. Hope is not a mood, it is an act. Barber quips, it's better to die having fought for justice than to live and stay on the sidelines and watch injustice have its way. 6th, bring humor and joy. The struggle is long. Bring your best jokes with you. Barber himself often laughs about his considerable size, his impromptu sermons, or his collection of arrest records. Because hope, like any great movement, needs both gravity and levity.
Thank you, Jack.
I have 3
think we need-
paragraphs left. We have recalled giants, Dr. King, the preacher, Baldwin, the poet, and James, the actor. Each a reminder that greatness is less about self-promotion and more about self-giving. These legacies converge beautifully in the work and witness of Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. He is the prophet who keeps knocking, the teacher who refuses to lose hope in America, the organizer who is never satisfied with hand-wringing. He calls us to be the moral defibrillators of our time, shocking the heart of this nation with the power of love, justice, and truth. So what can we do? We can join him. Stand up for the poor and the marginalized, challenge every false narrative, every cheap piety, every policy that puts profits over people. Build the fusion coalitions, resurrect the hope, and never ever underestimate what you can do, especially if you bring a little humor, a lot of stubbornness, and wear comfortable shoes. James Baldwin often insisted, we made the world we are living in, and we have to make it over. Friends, the hour is late, but it is not too late. The movement is gathering. And as Dr. Barber might say, if you can't find hope today, turn to the person next to you. You'll find it there in the togetherness that becomes the instrument of redemption. Let's get to work. Oh, by the way, if I don't know if I thought I saw some people taking notes. I will send a copy of this to anybody that puts their email in the chat, if for anyone that wants it.
Okay, thank you, Jack. It was good, but ran over here a lot of time. So we're going to turn over to Dr. Dick Burkhart for his segment. It's yours, Dick.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay, to make sure I'm muted. Yeah, well, I'm not going to give a sermon like that, but I'll have some of the same themes because I've been, and many of you know I'm a kind of a scholar type and I read lots of books of all different kinds. And in this endeavor with UMIA, one of the things I was looking for were allies. You know, we have this large group of people, what you might call woke people or woke, you know, in terms of race, people who follow critical race theory and things like that, who are not only powerful and dominant in the NAUA, but as Jack pointed out, in many universities and the National Education Association. So do we have some allies among like Black leaders? for example. And we do, and I found a number of those. So I'm going to talk about some of them. In particular, I read and reviewed books by several authors who were critical of what sometimes called critical race theory, which is the sort of academic discipline behind a lot of this nasty stuff that's going on. And this is what, as was pointed out, has been behind the UUA approach for probably 30 years now, but most people most of you don't know anything about it, very little. It's been very carefully hidden, and this is part of the whole strategy, is to sort of a stealth takeover. And so, in addition to the books and writings of Finley Campbell, I'm going to look at Coleman Hughes, Irshad Manji, John McWhorter, Teray Reed, Olufemi Taiwo, and Carlos Hoyt. They're all people of color who've taken on this critical race theory and have a different approach. And when I looked at these people, I found sort of five common themes. You'll recognize some of these, I think, from what's been said already. One of the most obvious things is that all of these authors reject this blame and shame game, where whites are shamed and blamed for everything. That was talked about earlier, the power plus prejudice kind of thing. Everyone roundly rejects that. Instead, they call for mutual respect, like Reverend Barber, for example. The second thing is, if you look back at history, all these people take inspiration from MLK and not from Stokely Carmichael. And the critical race theory and much of what goes on in the UA actually traces back to the Stokely Carmichael type Black power, which is based on antagonisms and separation. That is rejected thoroughly. A third common theme is that, and you've also already heard this one too, is that there's support for universal programs, like Barbara's talking about, things like Social Security and universal minimum wages, healthcare. And this support, the idea here is that all these authors say we support these things as universal programs independent of race or identity. And they note that when there's a focus on race and other kinds of identities, that this often serves elite interests because it becomes a divide and conquer tactic. So they want unity, and they want these things for all, not just, for example, reparations for Blacks. That's not what they're about. A fourth theme is that many of these people, these authors, scholars, say it was time for a post-racial worldview now. We've made a huge amount of progress. Let's build on that. Let's not pretend like critical race theory some of them have said, well, we've made no progress for 50 years, which is not true. It's just that progress takes generations, but it's happening. And they say we can go much further now than we have before. And we do this by working in solidarity with each other. And we base it on universal principles and not deferring to proclaimed racial authorities or other people like that. And UUA, at least historically, is very good on our 7 principles on this point of view. In fact, finally, the fifth theme I identified was we need to treat people as distinctive individuals, not as stereotypes or to be characterized by labels, such as victims over oppressors or inferiors or superiors. Sometimes that's called victimhood culture, is a key part of woke ideology. And so the fifth theme is that these people all reject the doctrines and practices that establish like in-groups and out-groups or authorities and followers based on presumed identity or ideology. So those are the 5 major themes I've identified. Now I'm going to go through and flesh out these themes a little bit by taking some quotes and particulars from these different authors. So my first theme again was about mutual respect and not blaming and shaming. And here Irshad Manji is quite interesting. Here's a quote from her. She says, "Hate gets turbocharged when those of us who bang the drum for inclusion drum out reasonable folks merely because their opinions don't match ours." So what she's talking about here has a very good example, and that is the anger of the white working class at the condescending elitism, we often use that term, coming from university culture, and which has earned it a reputation for hypocrisy. In other words, maybe the working class people don't agree with the elites, and they are drummed out because of that, especially in UU circles. UU circles, there are many fewer working class people than most religions. And she notes, Hermanji is very, very sharp. She notes that when people are humiliated, like by being called racist, like all whites are racist, for example, humiliation can radicalize. And that's the source of some of the white nationalism, unfortunately. And she says that the right wing counts on recruiting kids being hunted down by liberal language police. And there was their critical race therapy go overboard on racial language that unites their core but offends a lot of other people. In fact, John McWhorter calls this kind of purity not just a cult, but even a religion. And he says critical race theory is more like a religion than way it's practiced. And Touré Reed has pointed out that we could replace the ruling class by ritually purified anti-racists, and would make little difference in the absence of practical policies and politics. And Obama is a prime example. A wonderful man, anti-racist in every conceivable respect, I think. But did he really change anything by being anti-racist and a very good orators? Unfortunately, very little. McWhorter also notes, he gives some explanation of why some blacks are attracted to this critical race theory stuff, or what he calls woke racism. He talks about therapeutic alienation or noble victimhood, and there's playing the victim. But he shows how this always ends up backfiring in the end. There's a backlash against it. You may get some temporary solace if you're black and view yourself as a victim, but you're not going anywhere, and other people resent you. So those are what some of the authors said about the theme 1, about mutual respect. My theme 2 about the MLK legacy of rejecting divisive tactics, of integration, of black and white together. And Manji goes on to say that puritanical purity will destroy whatever it's meant to defend. Even though the diversity, even though inside the diversity posse, the DEI group, it's cool to be offended. And she also shows how this kind of language, this kind of attitude, which is the opposite of what Barbara talks about, is actually very counterproductive. She, for example, she takes on what she calls cry bullying. Cry bullying is playing the age-old game of abusing one's power while claiming powerlessness. And she also takes on cultural appropriation. She says only a transactional mindset which suggests that cultures can be owned and therefore embezzled from their owners. She says real cultures are endlessly kinetic, combining influences from near and far. And finally, McWhorter advises, when confronting the true believers of critical race theory, he says, stand your ground against true believers. State your moral principles and facts as best you know them, and refuse to be intimidated. Because as Richard Trudeau pointed out, it's all about, when they call you names, it's all about intimidation because they have something that's indefensible. And my third theme was about rejecting identity-based programs and policies. And here it's mentioned that Finley Campbell often talked about the rank and file to emphasize the unity of most workers, and how to him, what neo-racism really meant to him was that the power structures would ask how to keep whites and blacks from uniting to fight against neoliberal globalization and all the inequality and injustices it causes. So he's taken here on the divide and conquer thing. And he critiqued this tactic of focusing on racism as a psychosocial phenomena to be solved by introspection and confessions by the purported oppressor, not economic solidarity and injustice. And here he's taken on the white fragility crowd and saying, no, it's not just about a personal thing. And likewise, Ture Reid calls for a public good-oriented policies, such as living wage, and strongly opposes race reductionism, by which he means reducing all injustice to blaming whites. And Reid notes that the focus on the public goods has a long history, including the Domestic Marshall Plan or Freedom Budget proposed by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. And similarly, Taiwo, who has a background from Nigeria, calls for a constructive politics to replace the blame game. You know, in the UUA, they want to dismantle. That's destructive politics. They don't say what, they just want to dismantle. He calls for a constructive politics. He's asking us to become planners, designers, and builders of both infrastructure and institutions, and to be accountable to those not yet in the room. Let's think about future generations, not past generations. How can we be accountable and prepare the way for the future generations? And this leads into the theme of a post-racial worldview now. Coleman Hughes, for example, has studied the statistics and concluded that the solution is to get rid of the business of racial classification altogether, to adopt colorblind principles, including universal programs based on socioeconomic status, not racial reparations or affirmative action. And McWhorter actually makes fun of critical race theory people, if you haven't heard of some of this crazy stuff they talk about. He says, do you know that objectivity, being on time, and the written word are white things? And if that seems off to you, then you are one with George Wallace, Bill Connor, and David Duke. So a little humor there helps. And Carlos Hoyt also asks a provocative question. Is a nominally black person in the USA an American or a black? But what he notes is that this conundrum is of no importance to someone who rejects racial identity theory, by which he means selecting and sorting and attributing, essentializing, and acting on purported racial characteristics. So what he champions is what he calls race transcendence, which I think is a very good phrase. And finally, on rejecting stereotypes and labels, Finley Campbell strongly objected to the Orwellian labeling of even highly liberal institutions such as the UUA as having a white supremacy culture. And that became a dominant thing over the past decade. And I noticed they're starting to back off that terminology now, fortunately. And Coleman Hughes notes that when there's no evidence that a racial disparity comes from actual racism, then the phrase systemic racism is invoked to blame it on racism anyway. It often is kind of misused. Instead, he quotes Frederick Douglass. I conceive that there is no division of races. God Almighty made but one race. And finally, Irshad Manji says, how can racism recede if we continue relying on categories invented by racists? For example, as to intersectionality, he says, combination and permutations of labels still leave labels calling the shots. Instead, she calls us to take the moral courage to engage with empathy. That's like her fusion challenge. She says, to engage with empathy, she identifies as the kind of challenge that she agrees, where she agrees with Reverend Barber. And finally, Taiwo takes on what he calls deference politics. And this is at the core of woke identity politics. This means the deference to people to select individuals to what they describe as their lived experience, the lived experience of select individuals, people that McWhorter calls the elect. from presumed victim groups become the authority for white allies. And like other people, he's saying that these people who claim to be who claim to have the lived experience of people from their groups are often not representative. They're often represent their own elite or class interests, not their groups. And he calls for interdependence, not deference. So I've concluded that we have some very strong allies among some of the, what you call my dissident Black intellectuals, some of the people like Finley Campbell, Coleman Hill. Many of these people are kind of renegades in terms of the larger culture at the moment. And my final point is, what does this? I thought, well, these people are all critiquing things in the UUA, or at least I looked at that. What would this mean for the UUA? So of course, some of us are just leaving it, but first of all, I've concluded that this would mean the UUA should disband support for identity groups that are exclusive, segregated, ideological, or political. That means Drum, Blue, Trust, Allies for Racial Equality, all these different. Finley Campbell was very strong on saying it's time to get rid of support for these identity groups because of their political, exclusive, segregated nature, ideological nature. But what do you do instead? I would say foster programs such as Bravery Angels that cut across political, ideological, and other divides to build mutual respect and understanding. And third, I would say reject woke ideology outright, the whole ball of wax. Instead, seek common ground based on solid science and ethical human relations, grounded in our 7 principles. And finally, I would say to expand what we're doing, seek to engage with and include open-minded people from a wide variety of backgrounds, not just college educated or like-minded. Look for open-minded people that we can engage with from a wide variety of backgrounds, ethnic, everything else. So thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Obviously, the 10 minutes per each of the 4 of us, which was anticipated, has been exceeded by some of the individuals. I'm sure it was worth it for many of the audience, but that obviously leaves us with very little, if any, time for Q's, nays, and so forth. But I'll leave that up to Terry and Joanne to determine whether they want to leave it open for that for a few minutes.
I think maybe we should break because our talent show is starting in a couple of minutes. But I would invite, oh, I see David's got a question. We'll let David ask his question. And then I would invite today's speakers to go to the coffee chat tomorrow at 3 Pacific time. And oh, wait a second. I'm trying to remember if we have it tomorrow because the schedule's a little different. Anyway, I think this would be great if we had more time to ask questions. But if someone wants to ask them now, feel free. David, go ahead.
Just a brief comment on Richard Trudeau's. When they talked about privileged white, it always rankled me because I'm white. I served in Vietnam. Most in my unit in artillery were poor whites. We were not middle class. And every once in a while, when you see Vietnam protests, you'll see a sign where it'll say poor whites, blacks, or whatever are fighting and dying in the war. So yeah, Richard's on target with that. Thank you.
Is the coffee hour still in session until 9:30 as was posted in the schedule?
Yes, it is unhosted.
We could go there for questions tonight if it is still happening.
Yes,
you could.
it's still.
Yes, you could go there tonight.
All right, thanks.
Okay, with that, I am going to permit Joanne and Terry to end the recording, and some of us who are speakers will go to